All right, can you hear me okay? All right, so as you can see by this sort of patchwork title slide here, I couldn't settle on just one title, and that maybe reflects my own fragmentation around this topic, even though I've spoken about it in different places, this matter of integrating these treatments several times before. But I thought I would try something quite different this time, so we'll see how it goes. I'm going to talk about what I think are what I'm going to call some faith-oriented experiences that are essential and unavoidable in the learning process as clinicians immerse themselves in these treatment approaches, and we'll see where this goes. So one of my titles is borrowed from Thomas Merton's spiritual autobiography, The Seven-Story Mountain, and I'll say more about that. Another of my titles just says, it's been 10 years for me learning these treatments for BPD. And another title lists all of the different aspects of this learning that I'm going to reframe within the iconography and sort of phenomenological terminology of religiosity, and see if that reveals anything interesting or different as you each sit there and reflect on how you've learned these treatments and dedicated yourselves to them in various ways. So again, I borrow the title from Thomas Merton's Seven-Story Mountain, and you can't read it, but it says in the red box, the original cover, the autobiography of a young man who led a full and worldly life, and then at the age of 26 entered a Trappist monastery. And he was criticized at with the age when he published this, making these sweeping, maybe even grandiose statements about the nature of the world. And I fear I may be trying to do a bit of the same thing, so I may be subject to some of the same criticism today. But I'm co-opting Merton's approach, and the seven stories, if anyone isn't familiar, these are the 7 levels of purgatory in this book. And I think there's something sort of purgatorial about learning these treatments, because one does, I think, take something on some faith. As we're trying out new interventions, we're putting our trust in the people who teach us these approaches, and we don't actually know every moment that passes whether we're sort of moving upward or downward. We don't quite know where the ultimate destination for us or for the patient is going to be. So this is my single case report. That's my methodology for this presentation. It's highly biased and it's nearly completely free of objectivity, so something different than what you're hearing in most of these other talks. So again, why deploy the language of faith? Well, I am a person of faith. I'm not here today to proselytize to you, but faith does have something to do with, I'm interested in movements of faith, experiences of faith, sort of wherever they show up, outside of explicitly religious contexts, and so that's why I'm using this lens here. So just a little bit about my bona fides for a moment, just to say that over 10 years now I've been learning these treatments and trying to implement them both in a sequential way, in a way that's single model adherence driven, and then in other settings like the Gunderson residence where I work, some of you may be familiar with, is a very eclectic integrative approach. So in some contexts trying to actually live out adherence to one model, and in other contexts trying to actually think in a very individually centered way for each person which elements of each model are going to be most useful. So there's the rough timeline of the mountain for me. These aren't the order in which I present their importance or their usefulness to me, but simply the order in which I began learning each of them, with GPM at the bottom when I was a second-year resident at MGH McLean. And the arrows continue to the same point, the present moment, because I'm still actively trying to draw on all 4 of these treatments and find them all useful and valuable in different ways. So you're all familiar with slides that look like this, just demonstrating the alphabet soup. And you're also all familiar that these trainings are available for all these different treatments, yet actually delivering them remains costly and labor-intensive and difficult from a logistical implementation standpoint in a system, but also difficult to learn, I would actually argue, for some people, for some clinicians. We know the efficacy is roughly, more or less, as others have said, equivalent across all approaches, yet there are some pretty striking differences in how these treatments model and understand change in the mind. So there really are no objective guidelines for junior clinicians just entering the field. And I was interested in the process by which each of us has come to the point where we are in choosing our loyalties, as it were, to the particular treatments that we do, and what we might say to junior clinicians about how they might find their way. So it's not as subjective as choosing a favorite pony, like this is for my daughter. It's not as objective, I think, as a dry, impersonal, empirical process in the way that we might think of it. So how do we choose? How have we chosen? So you're all probably familiar with this age-old parable that shows up in multiple time periods and cultural contexts, this parable of the blind men examining different regions of the elephant. And it's a metaphor for, it's obvious what it's a metaphor for, sort of appreciating different aspects of a reality that no one person grasps in totality. So reapportioning this story for our time, thinking about these 4 treatment approaches, you can actually sort of have a sense that these different groups of people that I've learned from and trained with, and many of us in the room have, might also be sort of grasping different parts of the elephant. And that is one way to think about BPD and its treatment. And this is the one reference, I had to put one reference in, a paper that was just published in the JPD. And I'll just go on record now as saying that I think the commentaries actually have a number of very valid criticisms about the way we did this report. But what I want to highlight is that, basically what we were doing here was proposing 5 standards according to which these treatment approaches and models of BPD might be evaluated, and then thinking about how we evaluate the merits of each of them. And again, I think the criticisms are quite valid of the way that we propose to do this. The thing I want to highlight for this talk is that the 5th of these standards, really only one of these, is about a clinically experienced near question for a trainee. The rest are about sort of which model best carves nature at its joints, which is an important question. But for people starting out, I think there are many more experienced near questions that they think about. So just like learning to skydive is not the same as deciding what to believe about gravity, though it might include that, learning to treat BPD is not equivalent to deciding which theory best describes BPD, though it probably should include that, but it goes beyond. So this is where I say, well, I think there's some real subjectivity that I'm going to call faith of a sort that's required to decide how to try these treatments on for size and how far we go with any particular model. So if we didn't develop the treatment ourselves, then we learned it from someone who learned it from someone who learned it from someone who did. And this learning process requires faith at a variety of levels. Here are just 3. I'll borrow this term from MBT, epistemic trust, that we have to have some faith in the relevance and wisdom of what is taught by our teachers and supervisors when we're just starting out. And then there's these factors that are, we could call them temperamental or emotional or philosophical, that appeal to us or have some resonance that's sometimes hard to put into words, that appeals to our clinical worldview or maybe just our worldview in general. And then there's this willingness that's required to come and see, and I am using a scriptural quote there, to come and see and devote ourselves to this discipleship process. So I'm bringing in the language here. I'm calling it a bit of coming and seeing and discipleship because we can't really know the results of this learning process at the outset, but we discover piecemeal along the way something that I'm going to call tying the room together. So I just had to put Richard Dawkins on here because it has been argued that the goal really ought to be to eradicate faith in all of its contexts. And even in our paper, we said this review will have served its purpose if it diminishes faith-based loyalties to any theory, which I agree with. But I'm going to invoke a different kind of patron saint who doesn't have as much trouble embracing there's something mystical about his trajectory. So this is, of course, the dude in his various states of ecstatic experience. And I want to use this quote, "That rug really tied the room together." For anyone who's seen the movie, you know how that replays a number of times throughout. And so the dude kind of gives us an impressionistic, clinically experienced near standard for evaluating something about where we stand with each of these treatments as we're learning them. So I'm calling this, that treatment approach really ties the room together. And what I mean by that is that there's some elements within our subjective experience in the moment of all that's happening in the room that the treatment models sometimes tie together for us. And so some ways these models do that is that it might fit with our pre-existing sense about what BPD is or what the mind is, how change happens, or it might extend that in some way that resonates for us. It might fit with or extend our comfort level with trying certain kinds of interventions. It certainly has done that for me. I think each model fosters a kind of reflexive, ritualistic practice that promotes and sustains our engagement with the patient, our interest, our non-judgmental stance, our basic positive regard, in a way that those engagement modes become less effortful for us over time so that we can actually pay attention in a different way once we've learned these sort of default modes for each of the treatments. I think they also provide a quick and dirty roadmap in the moment for understanding what might be transpiring between me and the patient. And that quick and dirty roadmap then gets linked with possibilities about how did we get here this moment and where might we go next. And then that generates a little increased confidence about what to try and say and do next. And then, of course, these provide a lens for stepping back in between sessions and evaluating the progress of the case. So this is the rug that ties the room together for me. And each of these treatments do that. So here's the last bit of faith terminology. So we're going to look at these 4 treatments, re-examined through the lens of faith experiences that I think are there for all of us in some way on the road to learning these. So each starts for me with a kind of crisis of faith, some sense of needing to expand my pre-existing understanding about BPD or personality disorders and treatment. There's new dogma that each treatment comes with, that have to do with what you do in the basic treatment approach and what theoretical commitments come with that approach. There's patron saints, those who teach and model and sort of galvanize our interest in these approaches. And then there are these companions on the journey that supervise us. What I'm calling discipleship, or we might call baptism by immersion. This is not just going to the 3-day training, but actually getting supervision, working on a team, choosing to immerse yourself in the model to a point of developing some facility and real competence and confidence with it, which takes time. And then there are leaps of faith that come along the way. As you're in the middle of the learning process, there's hurdles that come up that you have to surmount in order to sustain yourself within that new standard of approach, rather than going back to something that might feel more instinctive. So I'm calling that a kind of leap of faith. And then for me, there have been these conversion experiences for each of these 4 paths, and I'm calling them intimations because these are subjective impressions in the moment that you become more confident in over time only. These are experiential sort of proofs of concept that the treatment is onto something and you're onto something different with your patient using this particular treatment lens. So I won't have time to go through all of these in great depth, but we'll touch on each of them a bit. So the first crisis of faith for me was just beginning to work with borderline patients. So it was something like this: help, I have a borderline patient, and what little I know of therapy, which was very little, isn't working. So here's, of course, one of the patron saints. So John Gunderson's GPM, Good Psychiatric Management. So one of the initial dogma that you learn is about understanding the patient's changing symptomatic presentation moment to moment as a reflection of changes in levels of connectedness interpersonally. So this is from the Taylor Swift video. I think it's the best way to sort of see this. Our residents love this when we show it to them. And you can see the patient moves through these varying levels of connectedness versus interpersonal threat versus feeling truly abandoned. And you get a sense about what to do in the moment with the person. Do I really have 5 minutes left? Oh. A little bit more, okay. So there's sacraments that go with this role. You embrace the medical aspects of the clinical role. There's an emphasis on case management techniques rather than deep psychotherapy techniques. And this goal of getting a life is what trumps the goal of symptom reduction and deeper personality change. There are conversion experiences that I've had along the way. I'm doing short shrift on this, I apologize, but GPM did initially for me rapidly facilitate a burst of confidence in working with these patients and learning how to work in teams and split modalities become important parts of these patients' lives. That's retained an efficacy for me, those GPM frameworks about what to do at the beginning of a treatment before you've even started psychotherapy, and what to do with our chronic persistent folks when they've had other evidence-based psychotherapies and they seem like they're stuck. The next crisis of faith was, help, I have patients with scary, dangerous behaviors that actually could die under my care. What do I do about my anxiety? And this is where I started to learn DBT, and you all know how DBT works, so I'll skip this. But the crisis of faith was that light roast blend of GPM wasn't sufficient for every patient, although it was sufficient for many. So the new behavioral dogmas that came with DBT had to do with this emphasis on changing behavior actually as being the primary target, and the belief that actually that will spur other changes in sense of self and relationships that we're interested in. And the discipleship is intense with DBT. There's a lot of time that's committed both to being with your patient, being available outside of office hours if need be, teaching them in groups, learning the skills yourself. And the sacraments have to do with, actually, in a way, for me, an increased accountability to moment fine-grained behavioral assessment. That was a new kind of accountability for me to learn, and was enhanced through videotaping and very close supervision by Joan Wheelis and other people you see here. So the leap of faith had to do with trusting that my assessment of reinforcers was valid, and so that involved sometimes withholding attention to certain targets that the patient wanted to work on in order to prioritize things that were more life-threatening, using the relationship as a shaping tool. These were new concepts for me at this stage of training. And the conversion experience really mostly had to do with the power of behavioral shaping and learning that for myself. It's not something that MDs really are trained in much. Go quickly through the rest. The next crisis of faith was, well, what about my toughest patients who've already had DBT or don't qualify for it in a way? They don't have stage 1 target behaviors, or they just won't do it, but they're still really sick. So along came MBT, and around this time actually sort of got the initial training, learned about this process of marked contingent mirroring, this idea of epistemic trust and mistrust, and the essential dogmatic changes for me had to do primarily with a different kind of continuous assessment of the patient's problem in the moment. And the target was about enhancing mentalizing capacity, not changing specific thoughts, feelings, or behaviors, but a more meta-level, process-oriented target. And the discipleship was similar to the other approaches. The sacraments had to do with consciously peeling back what we'd call higher order, higher level mentalizing interventions on my part that just won't land with a non-mentalizing person. So this added a whole new lens for thinking about the patient's receptivity to anything I'm doing in the moment, no matter what treatment it is I'm using, whether it's teaching a skill in DBT or giving an interpretation in TFP. We can overlay MBT on top of all these other approaches, and that's one of the things I've carried forward from MBT. That's part of my conversion experience. And then lastly, help. Some patients seem hell-bent on defeating me. And might I be using DBT and MBT to avoid something somehow within myself or within the patient? And so you can guess this might have to do with the primacy of aggression as a process that results in fragmentation, identity diffusion, sort of these split-off experiences that are very hard for our patients to talk about, and for me, countertransferentially, hard for me to notice within myself, actually, even though I trained in these other approaches. So I'm skipping sort of the hows of TFP here for time, but the leaps of faith had to do with a bit of a return to my earliest psychodynamic training and some faith in these processes of confrontation and interpretation, with peeling away the support and validation that I think the other treatments are actually heavier in. And this was the other leap of faith, speaking further beyond the level of the patient's conscious awareness than I think MBT does or DBT does. And in a way, that's offering less of our own minds and more of our own minds at the same time. Because in MBT, we're quite transparent about, well, if it was me, I might do this. We don't do that in TFP, actually. We work more in the transference. And that has to do with, let's see, where did it go here? Oops, where'd it go? That you see the unspoken dynamic in the room primarily as a product of the patient's internal working model, not as an MBT, something that's sort of co-created between you, something you might even apologize for or acknowledge one's role in. In TFP, you sort of just take it up and work with it, fully taking that role on yourself. One of my patron saints is in the room here on the left. And my conversion experiences in TFP so far, as I've getting the supervision over the last year and a half or so, had been that in a number of cases that I hadn't been able to treat effectively in other models, it's generated increased unrest in the treatment, both in me and in the patient. But that actually has led to increased change and increased owning off of these split-off experiences that I really didn't feel could be gotten at in other treatments. This technique of naming the actors sort of has pushed me to speak sooner to an experience that I will have subjectively sometimes of the patient trying to defeat me, or there's something aggressive in the room that other models might understand as reactive or as a failure in mentalizing or a failure in skills implementation. But TFP understands that differently as actually an intentional drive that may be entirely out of conscious awareness. That changes the technique significantly, and that's freed me up to view some behaviors as primarily driven by intention, that previously I would have viewed as driven by deficit or failure. So it's added quite a lot. So there's a lot in common for all these treatments that you know these commonalities. Lots of papers have written about it. And I want to say that even the distinctive elements are not mutually exclusive. So that from each of these treatments, I can pull forward into any case, any treatment approach that I'm doing at the time, I can pull these various elements forward into the moment. And I found that that integrative stance is where I'm at now. And I don't have time, maybe if there's time for questions later in discussion, I put a slide together just saying, so what do I think makes a good fit between each model and each clinician? And I'll save that for another time. I better stop. Yeah.